All right, welcome back to our church history class, and we're on chapter 12 now, which is looking at the French Revolution and Napoleon. So I think a really important, as I was saying at the end of the class last week, a really important chapter for us as Catholics, coming off of we talked at the end of last class about Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, some of their philosophy and ways that they were starting to talk about things. You could already kind of see in the water that it was going to go badly for the church, and certainly it did. And the French Revolution was one that takes place about the exact same time as the United States Revolution, the French Revolution being a few years later, 1789, and the American Revolution being in 1776. And so you have this spirit of revolution taking place in these two different countries, our country and in France as well. But they took on very different forms, and they happened very differently because of the culture. Lots of different factors. Some of them we'll get into. But it's important to note that just because you are in the spirit of revolution and you're deciding to move away from kings and queens and monarchies and stuff like that, doesn't mean you're going to end up in the same place. And the French did not end up in the same place that the United States did. And it has a lot to do, we'll get into some of that in a little bit. But again, the French Revolution takes place about the same time as the American Revolution, but again, very different results and very catastrophic results really for the Catholic Church in France. Okay, so prior to the Revolution of 1789 in France, you have the three estates that make up the people. The first estate is the clergy, and the clergy were really involved in, of course, they owned lots of land. The Catholic Church owned lots of land, and they would use that land to raise money to then support the charitable stuff, obviously also build new things. And as with everything, there's always going to be corrupt clergy too who are taking advantage of the system and using it for themselves. But the Catholic Church, as it always does, wherever it's at, the vast, vast majority of what's taking place there is charitable work and serving the poor and so forth in the areas. The hospitals, schools, all that kind of stuff, just like it does pretty much everywhere else. They had the second estate, which was the aristocratic nobility, kind of the ruling non-clergy, the people that were, had control of the economic institutions and stuff like that. And then you had the third estate, which was the bourgeoisie, the peasants, the people who were, didn't have that sort of aristocratic nobility, weren't maybe born into the families and that kind of thing. A lot of basically the lowest class in that sense in the French system at the time. Now, what you have going on then in the run-up to the revolution is you have a debt crisis, a national debt crisis that really explodes in France, where they had been loaning out money or borrowing money, all these different things. The French debt actually consumed 100% of the income that it was taking in through taxes and everything. There was a year there leading up to the revolution where the national income, all the money that came in to the country through taxes, that's an unbelievable thing, right? So as they were taking in all this money from their taxes, it all went right back out to pay off the debt and the interest payments that they own. You start to see the wealthy, in the run-up to the part of the problem is the wealthy refused to pay taxes. They just stopped, and the people that really could do that. So they weren't taking in as much money, the country wasn't, so they weren't able to pay off their debt. So then eventually you have the revolution. It starts in small ways, but riots that start taking place where the people just kind of there's an uprising because of not having of food shortages and not having enough money that are around. And so that's where you might have heard of the storming of the Bastille, which is where a lot of those who are involved in the uprising, mostly the poorer people, but not all, storm the Bastille, which was where kind of an army fortress, and they start taking the guns and things like that to use in the revolution. So it's kind of the beginning of the revolution. They then set up a couple different ruling bodies trying to kind of pull together, okay, we've got all the spirit of revolution going on, and we're getting rid of the king and all that stuff. So they set up a national assembly to run the country, and just kind of, again, they're trying to piece this all together, get all these different groups together to help make decisions. and they issue the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, right? So you'll see some similarities with our Declaration of Independence and some of the things that you see going on in America and throughout Europe as well. But this belief in the fact that all people are created equally, which is obviously a good thing, and that we all have rights and so forth, which the church has always taught as well. The king is eventually kidnapped, okay, and then they establish a new body from the National Assembly. They establish this other group, the Legislative Assembly. But again, you can just see this. It's kind of as people are revolting and everything, they're trying to, it's just kind of a ragtag group of people trying to rule things and figure out things and move forward in the midst of an uprising, which you always have that going on. Now, here's the problem really for the church is that as in the midst of this revolution, they come for the church, right? The people realize that one of the things we can do to help pay off this debt and so forth is to come after the church's lands. And so the Legislative Assembly confiscates church lands. It also, though, goes this really takes another step as well, which is they establish a sort of national church, and which basically cuts off all relationship to Rome. There is no more relationship with Rome, essentially. And it serves as the social arm of the secular government, right? So what we mean by that is this new national church, this French church that has nothing to do with Roman Catholicism anymore, right? They set it up, and they're looking for people to be priests and bishops and stuff who are voted on by the people, and they are to do the charitable work, right, of the government. Now, here's the problem, and we're going to get into this more later, right? But a lot of the problem that we even see in our own day right now is that a lot of people think that charity doesn't need anything underneath it. It doesn't need a belief in God to go out and feed the poor, to care for the sick, to care for to run hospitals, to do schools and institutions, right? But here's the church the church came up with hospitals, the church came up with universities, the church came up with in a lot of ways caring for the poor as a life, as a vocation, right? These things. It's the Catholic Church that came up with these things. And it's at the core of that work is this belief that God loves all people, that God is the giver of all rights, but also this belief that God's calling us to serve other people. God's calling us to teach those who are ignorant. God is calling us to help care for the sick, to feed those who are hungry, right? All these things, that's what for 2,000 years in the church's history has really driven and motivated and moved the church to do these kinds of things. There were no universities before the Catholic Church. There was no sort of large-scale attempt to care for poor people, right? Anywhere, right? And the problem is what happens is as you get into the 1789 and 1790s, right, people have begun to forget where this impulse, and this is happening in the United States too. Everyone just looks around and thinks, oh, well, everybody knows that we should care for the poor. We don't need God to tell us that. Everyone knows we should, have universities and have education and all these kinds of things. We can do that ourselves, right? But the problem is that that as soon as you start doing that, cut off from the engine of it, which is God, right, and this belief that God is calling us to this, then it all starts to fall apart and it doesn't work. And it's not actual charity, right? Communists tried it too, right? Communists have tried to do all of these things, and what happens is people suffer, misery sets in because it's not being done out of love, and it fails, right? It fails very quickly and it falls apart. Hospitals fall apart, caring for the poor falls apart, and everyone's poor, right? And this idea of education and universities and all that kind of stuff, that just falls apart too. So the French try it, okay? Other people have tried it before too. We'll just set up a secular government and we'll just make our own church, right? Without any relationship to Rome, without any relationship to God and all those kinds of things, right? So they cut off all the administration from the Pope, and the priests are chosen by local assemblies and citizens, and non-Catholics even get involved in helping choose the bishops, right? So it's not really the Catholic Church anymore. It's the French church that it just made out of nowhere. Now, the revolution, of course, though, as it does that, but the revolution turns even more violent. And what happens is that initially, in the initial fervor, it's kind of the middle class is kind of steering the ship, but then the lower class, the poor urban working class, who had really fallen on hard, had been treated poorly, as typically all the poor who are living in the inner city, at least since the rise of the modern city, right? Unfortunately, they had really been downtrodden for a long time. And of course, so they begin to actually take over the revolution. And the guillotine really starts firing up and starts killing people. King Louis XVI is sentenced and killed. Many Catholics are put to death as well. And this one of the people that's kind of leading this second wave of the revolution, this even kind of the peasant uprising, if you will, the poor working class as they take over, they're really led by this guy named Robespierre, right? And under him, there's this reign of terror. They create a committee on public safety, which is supposed to go out and find out all these other people that are trying to undo the revolution, right? So counter-revolutionaries. And so basically they have a blank check to kill anyone that they feel like might be trying to undo the revolution and go back to the way it was before. And so the guillotine killed almost 40,000 people, right? Which is just an astonishing number. Just a real madness sets in amongst the French Revolution as this is going on. And you'll notice none of this kind of stuff is happening in the United States in the midst of their revolution and what they're creating. And so again, I think that's important to just call attention to that. These are some quotes I wanted to just recite or read to you from your book. I don't often quote, large sections from your book, but I found these to be really helpful to give us a snapshot. The Catholic Church in France was a lightning rod for persecution. Considering Christianity counter-revolutionary or trying to undo the revolution, the committee launched a program of de-Christianization, trying to de-Christianize, trying to take the church completely out of the French culture, okay? Missionary representatives were sent into the countryside to close down churches, hunt down priests, and punish anyone accused of harboring clergy. Church buildings were vandalized, gospel books and crucifixes were burned, statues and relics of the saints were destroyed, church bells were melted down to make cannons and sacred vessels for their precious metal. People were offered bounties for turning over priests who refused to take an oath of loyalty to the revolutionary government. It was ordered that any priest found resisting the policies of the National Convention was to be executed within 24 hours. Under the pretext of enforcing the committee's policies, Catholics were killed publicly in cruel and gruesome ways. Mobs massacred entire monastic communities. Christian women and children were murdered to prevent the spread of Christianity to future generations, right? And in fact, Robespierre, this leader of this sort of secular war against the church, even had they had fake masses in the cathedral in Paris, where he was set up as the God and the God of reason and wisdom and all these kinds of things. And really it was a direct assault on the Catholic Church. And really there was this, when you look at it and you read the history of it, there's really just this deep-seated desire and evil attack really against the church in so many ways. That's really what began to define the revolution, although, of course, initially it was, we want to get rid of and have a new government and get rid of the king. Really, in its latter stages, and in particular way, the French Revolution really was about the uprising seeking and intending to try to do everything that it could to destroy the Catholic Church in France and drive it out from its midst. Kind of out of this, as the revolution is starting to wind down, and again, all the problems are still present. The church has been persecuted, but you have all the starvation, and you still have a lot of poverty. The debt's not really been fixed or anything like that. In the midst of the rabble of what's happening, we have the rise of Napoleon. He rises through the ranks of the military, and he becomes a general. Then he becomes a ruler of France in order to restore things, right? And so he was given lots of power and authority to try to bring back order and restoration to the chaos, really, that had ensued for many years in France in the midst of this revolution. Initially, he's kind of favorable to the church, just to he kind of restores some things, gives them some power. But after he names himself the Emperor of France, he really then again he marches on Rome and imprisons the Pope and 13 cardinals because Napoleon and his brother both wanted divorces and annulments, and they weren't granted them. And so they, as with Henry VIII in England, they're both about divorces. But eventually at the end of his life, Napoleon tries to invade Russia. The French army is routed. Napoleon is exiled, and really in a neat way, the Pope really treats the Pope who had been imprisoned by Napoleon. Really shows a lot of mercy towards Napoleon and his family, and treats them with much charity. And Napoleon is actually restored to full communion in the Catholic Church before he passed away. So just a quick little reflection on democracy here, that these are some quotes as well from, I think they're both from the UCAT, which is the Catechism for Young People. But just to talk about democracy, right? Because we see democracy springing up in both the United States and in France and other places too. But it's really important to understand this, right? Democracy, we believe as Catholics that democracy, this idea that it's not about the king, it's not about anything, it's about this idea that we all have rights, that we all have the ability to elect our leaders and those kinds of things, that springs up in these places. Democracy depends on preconditions that it cannot guarantee in and of itself, but religion can provide them, right? We believe that at the core of democracy is a real Catholic push here, right? There is a lot of what is inherent in a democracy, and this idea that people have rights, that people ought to be allowed to elect their leaders, these kinds of things, this freedom that we hear about. We believe as Catholics that it depends. You can't just drop in and just say, hey, we're going to have a democracy. It has to come from a people who understand that. And so I guess basically what I'm trying to say here is that the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, but particularly I think the Catholic Church, really helps pave the way and provides fertile soil for which a democracy can spring up out of. This democracy that we have in our country, in the United States, a democratic republic, right? It's the church, it's these Christian notions that are really going to be necessary. If you had a bunch of people who were not Christian at all, and this is what this quote's basically trying to say, if you had a bunch of people who were not Christian, who had never heard of Christ or anything like that, democracy really wouldn't work. It really wouldn't thrive, right? Because they would say, well, why does that person have rights? We, as people in a democracy, we say, where do our rights come from? Our rights come from God, who's made us in his image and likeness, right? And so we have these preconditions present in our culture. So it's really important, I think, for us to know that. It's not just going to democracies don't just miraculously work. They have to have, and they also have to be, not only do they have to have people leading the way and clearing the ground and making the soil possible, but they also then need to be sustained by virtuous people, right? If a democracy is, let's say, so we have this, kind of Christian and Catholic culture in which democracy springs up in our country, in the United States and else in other places too. It won't be sustained if people abandon their Christian principles, right? So you need Christian and Catholic principles really to start up a democracy, to have a people that are willing to do it, but then it also needs to be continually renewed and supported and sustained by people who are also living out these Christian and Catholic principles of life, or else it will fall apart as well. And the popes have always been warning us about that and have been saying, look, you can't just put it on autopilot. You cannot just put democracy on autopilot. You have to continually democracy needs a new group of virtuous people trying to do the right thing, people who are motivated by a love of God and love of neighbor in order to keep it going, right? And so just as it can't take off in the midst of people who aren't Catholic and Christian, it will fall apart also in the midst of people who are Catholic and Christian, right? This is another quote. The church supports democracy because of all political systems, it offers the best conditions for achieving equality before the law and safeguarding human rights, the rights that come to us from God. In order to do that, however, democracy must be more than majority rule. True democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law that recognizes the fundamental God-given rights of all and defends them, if necessary, even against the will of the majority, right? So what makes democracy in our democratic republic in the United States, the kind of democracy that eventually emerges kind of out of some other areas as well, France and England, once everything kind of calmed down, the kind of democracy that comes out of that, right, is really a protection of people's rights, even in the face of the majority, right? And so it's not majority rule as much as it is protecting basic rights even against the majority. And so I had a history teacher when I was in high school who said it's not democracy isn't so much majority rule, it's the minority is protected. And I think that's a very good way of saying kind of what we believe as Catholics, that a democracy ought to respect and protect the basic dignity and human rights of all people, even those that are not in the majority. So some nice little reflections on democracy that kind of is coming up now in this era in France and England and elsewhere. Okay, so your one question, just write a paragraph, okay, 4 or 5 sentences. Sum up what happened in the French Revolution in a paragraph. You know, what happened with regards to the French Revolution in the church. Just hit some of the major points that we talked about there in the class, okay? Because I think it's a really important era for us to understand both kind of our own era and also kind of how and where the church sits in relationship to all of these questions. So that's your one question for the day is a paragraph. You can just send that in to me via email or bring it into church. Again, I hope that you're doing well. Know of my prayers for you. If I can do anything ever for you, please let me know. And I hope that you're continuing to live out your life of prayer and going to Mass and doing all those other things that also are key to not just the intellectual life, which is important, but also living out our Catholic faith as well. If I can ever help with anything, please let me know. God bless and have a great week.